This presentation is really meant to be an overview about the whole admissions process starting from A to Z. I'm going to touch base a little bit about some of the most important components for medical school planning. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the state of medical school admissions. And then towards the end, I'm going to talk a little bit about the services that we can offer through Potomac Oak. But before we begin, I wanted to say that if anybody has any questions, please just throw the question in the chat. And at the very, very end of the seminar, I'll try to answer as many questions as I can, I promise. Just depends on how much time that we have, okay? All right, so our history of success. So we've been working on medical school admissions since around 2019. And the services that we've been offering include advisory services, essay editing, interview prep, application coaching, and MCAT prep. And for those who don't know, MCAT is the equivalent to the SAT or the ACT. It's the admissions exam that you have to take, every pre-med has to take in order to get into medical school. All right, so a little bit about me. So my name is Farah. I am an MD PhD candidate. I attended the University of Pennsylvania as an undergrad. I majored in biology with a minor in psychology. I had a really great experience at Penn. It was definitely a very competitive environment going to an Ivy League school. But at the same time, being pre-med, I really got to learn a lot about the admissions process in general. And I also had the opportunity to work with the pre-health career advising and as well as work a little bit in admissions at Penn, just to understand what it's like to get into medical school or even an Ivy League school in general, because I never had gotten help when I had applied. So I just became really fascinated with the whole idea of admissions and what people are looking for. After I graduated, I spent some time doing research, and my journey is a little bit different than a lot of medical students in that I was always passionate about research, but I just didn't know if I wanted to do a PhD or if I wanted to do medical school. So what I ended up doing was kind of spend a lot of time doing research, but then also engaging in clinical research and shadowing physicians and seeing patients. And by doing so, I really got exposed to both. And so that's when I decided, after doing my fellowship at the NIH, to pursue an MD PhD career. And so for those who don't know, an MD PhD is basically a dual degree program that some medical schools offer. What's nice about it is that you do 2 years of medical school, and then you do your PhD, and then you finish off medical school after you finish your PhD. And there's a lot of perks about doing an MD PhD. It's really meant for physician scientists or people who want to be professors and teach and go into academic administration, as well as engage in research. And so that's the kind of stuff that I really want to do in the future. And yeah, so I've been working with Potomac Oak now for 3 years, and I've had an amazing, awesome experience. And I've got to work with students of all ages, ranging from freshmen in high school up until seniors in college, and even post-bac students who have their bachelor's degree and were applying for medical school. And so I've been kind of working throughout all these years, all the different aspects of medical school admissions. And we're finally doing this, which is so exciting for me as a consultant to share all my knowledge. So I wanted to start off the seminar with just a simple question, right? Why medicine? So a lot of you here are parents, or maybe high school students or college students who may or may not be contemplating the idea of medicine. And especially with COVID, I think there's been a surge in interest in going into the field of medicine. So if you're contemplating medicine, these are some of the questions or ideas that kind of lead people to medicine in the first place, right? So I think the most common one is it's a passion or calling. So for a lot of people, even for myself, I remember I just was, out of all the different careers that you can explore, usually medicine, it's more, there's a humanistic component to it. And if you're somebody who's very empathetic and you really care about others, uh, it's almost, it feels like a calling. It feels like this is your life's work, that you can't do anything that will bring you the same joy and happiness as, and fulfillment as the field in medicine. Because again, there's just so many components to medicine, right? You're helping people at every stage of their illness, and depending on the specialty that you go into, it can be a very rewarding experience, I think. Overall. And so it kind of goes with helping others, right? So there's this passion, there's calling, and then also this idea that you really want to help others. For some people, it's also a personal story. Maybe they went through an illness, for instance, or perhaps they had a family member who experienced an illness, or maybe it's something that just like runs in the family as well, right? Maybe a parent or a grandparent, somebody is in medicine, and so they have this very personal connection to the field. Another common reason why medicine is science, right? So some students are really smart in science, and they might show that ability at a pretty young age. Maybe I would say around middle school is when you start to take some of those biology classes and science classes, and you start to think about experiments. And so being good at science, you start to hear from your parents, maybe your teachers, your family members, right? Oh, she's good at science, or he's good at science. Oh, they should be a doctor. And that was kind of, for me, a little bit, I loved science in middle school, but I was also really a curious kid. And so for me personally, I liked history. I also liked English. But being good at science, I think, takes a different type of thinking, right? And if you start to show that early on and you're a young kid, you know, it starts to kind of stick in your mind a little bit. So for some students, you know, that's really why they even became interested in it, is just simple suggestions from parents and adults. A big one I would say is prestige, right? So there's definitely a societal expectation or reward for being a doctor, right? That if you went through all these years of training, that there is this prestige attached to it. In addition to that, it's also the fact that you're saving people's lives, right? So, you know, I'm sure we've all heard of, during COVID, healthcare heroes, right? So there's a reason why we put doctors on a pedestal. And again, it's because we as patients and as a society rely on physicians. And so there is a prestige attached to it that can't be ignored. And that's, for some people, it's very attractive to them. Another big one I would say is job security, right? We definitely need, we're always going to need doctors, right? So during the ups and downs of the economy or any sort of economic downturn, physicians usually are in a pretty good shape. It's a very highly specialized field, and it's a field that is kind of protected, right, because of the need. And then another reason could be high compensation. So physicians in general, and I'll talk a little bit more about compensation, generally are paid pretty well for the job that they do, especially relative to other similar fields. And the last one, which can be debated a little bit for those who maybe are physicians themselves who are watching this, or maybe you're married to one, lifestyle, right? So depending on the field that you choose, the lifestyle of being a physician could be very busy, right? Or it could be very relaxed, actually. I know for me personally, some of my friends who are finished with training, they pick fields like emergency medicine, where maybe they're only working 3 weeks at a time, and then they take 2 weeks off, and then they go back and they work another 3 weeks. So there's a way to structure it. You know, if you're a dermatologist, for instance, working in a private practice, you can schedule your time a little different, where maybe you can have the weekends off, or you can finish by 9 to 5, or you could be a surgeon who is working all the time, 80 hours a week, right? So you can really pick what kind of lifestyle you envision for yourself, and if you have a family, or what you would expect being a physician through which specialty you choose, right? And if you decide to stay in an academic field or an academic center, or if you go into private practice, for instance, which is generally a little bit more relaxed, I think. So they did a study here on the right side. So I threw this graph in here so that you can all see. So they did a study, I think this was a qualitative survey where they had about 1,500 physicians who were surveyed. And they were asked this question after 5 years post-training. So that means they went through medical school, they finished their residency, they finished their fellowship, and now they're practicing as licensed physicians. And you can see here that the top 3 answers for what was the most rewarding part of their job are kind of similar, right? So gratitude, relationships with patients. So again, that people humanity aspect. And then we have being very good at what I do / finding answers, diagnoses. So that I think kind of goes with the whole idea of being good at science, right? That if you're a critical thinker, you're somebody who likes to answer questions, to solve puzzles, right? Solve problems, but also you really, really deeply care about the people that you're helping, then this becomes a very rewarding part of your job, right? And lastly, being a physician, one of this top answer is knowing that I'm making the world a better place. So not every field can say that necessarily, but a lot of other fields do, right? A lot of other fields do actually, help people, and there is a lot of gratitude, right? So the question really becomes, is that it, right? What makes medicine different, okay? And so that's a question that I think I hope we can touch on a little bit, and also something to think about as you, when I say you, I'm talking to the student here who's possibly interested, or your child who might be interested, what they're really thinking about in terms of what's going to motivate them to continue pursuing such a long, yet again, rewarding career, okay? The other few ones here is making a good money at a job that I like, teaching, being proud of being a doctor. So those kind of, again, rank really, really low, right? Not necessarily as much as empathy that's involved here. All right. So I thought I would throw this slide in here so that we can talk a little bit about compensation, which I think is something that if anybody's going to be interested in pursuing a career, right, that's something that you're going to be thinking about, is what is the current compensation looking like? And if you are in medicine right now, or if you know anybody who's in medicine, compensation is something that is relatively stable, but it's also something that may or may not change, right? So what I found here is, so this is from Medscape. So Medscape is it's a website that basically throws a lot of information. It's an informative website for mostly physicians. It gives you a lot of information, different articles about news and related to medicine. And one of the things that they love to do are these surveys. And so they basically they did the survey and they studied the average annual physician compensation. And in this case, this is for academic physicians. So these are not physicians working in private practice. Private practice physicians generally make more money. So this is kind of just if you worked at a hospital, for instance, or an outpatient center that was affiliated with a hospital. And so here you can see that usually anything that's related to any sort of procedure is going to be compensated better. And the reason is because these procedural based specialties generally are covered by insurance, right? And so and not necessarily plastic surgery, especially if it's outpatient, but any sort of surgery in general is going to, again, because it's procedure based, is going to be compensated well. So while maybe not all plastic surgery is covered by insurance, they're still going to be paid very, very well. Same thing with orthopedic surgeons, cardiologists, ENTs, urologists, GI physicians, dermatologists. So in general, the pay scale really starts sometimes even a little bit lower. I would say maybe like 200,000 based off of the research that I've done. up until around, and it can go up to, depending again if it's a private practice or academic center, but this is generally the numbers that they got here from the survey that they did. But you can see that the compensation increases slightly, right? And so you can see that for primary care providers, the compensation is going to be running around 200,000, maybe a little bit more than that, right? And there's a nice trend there. If we're talking about specialists, so these are people who decided to go beyond an internal medicine residency, or they decided to do more of these procedural-based residencies, you can see that the specialists, right, are compensated a little bit more, and the trend is also increasing as well. So overall, the trend is increasing. So so physicians are paid very nicely, and that's great, right? Especially with the economy and everything that's going on. But again, so the seminar is really just to give you some information for students who are thinking about medicine as a career, but might be considering other careers as well. So while physicians are paid very well and there's a lot of job security and stability, there are other fields that are similar in that regard. So the reason, again, to enter medicine should not be to be highly compensated, right? As we saw in the previous slide, where again, the money is just not really a big factor here, right? So making good money at a job that I like was only 10% the reason, right? You can make a lot of money doing other things. So again, you get compensated well for your time and for your training, but that's not the main reason why you should do it. All right, so this slide right here talks about a current trend right now going on with physicians in the field in general. And in reality, what's happening here is that we have a physician shortage in the United States and all around the world. But this specifically looks at the United States. And this was a paper, actually, that was a report that was published by the AAMC. And AAMC is the major organization that controls the medical school admissions. And they're also a big resource in general for the state of medical affairs. And what they found here is that, so this was published in 2019. And what they're looking at is basically where we're at in terms of how many physicians we have, right? And how many physicians that we need, right? Based off of our population. So in the US, we do have an aging population. In fact, the population aged 65 and older is projected to grow by 42.4%, okay? And that's primarily due to the 74% growth in size of the population aged 75 and older. Okay, so what's happening here is that people who are over the age of 75, there's a huge growth of that aging population, and we're seeing again that same growth going on for people over the age of 65. Okay, and that's where we start to think about end of life care, right? And how do we manage a changing healthcare system, right, where we can accommodate this aging population? Okay, and that's really the question that this report was looking at. At the same time, in terms of the aging population, we also have significant population growth, right? So the US population is projected to grow by 10.6%, right? From 328 million to around 263 million. And so if you can look at this graph, we're seeing this huge widening gap here in terms of how many physicians we have currently, right? And where our projections are, and where it's going to where there's going to be the shortage, right? So by 2034, right, it's telling us we will have about 37,800 physicians, but we're probably going to need about 124,000, right? So there's this huge gap here in terms of the range in physician shortage. Okay, so there's this supply and demand issue going on. So the idea here is that we need doctors, right? We're going to need a lot. All right. So I talked a little bit about medicine in general. I talked about why people typically go into medicine, what the compensation looks like, and also in terms of the state at which there's a huge physician shortage already going on, and it's only going to be projected to increase, right? So we need more doctors. So what this is showing us medical school admissions, okay, in general. And so you can see this graph shows us from 1980, right, to 2022, 2023. So this is a very recent statistics here. So what we're seeing here is that this blue line is telling us all the applicants who applied for medical school, okay, starting from 1980 all the way up until this cycle, this past cycle right here. So you can see that there is a upward trend, right? So there's a couple dips, right? Maybe in the early 90s, right? Maybe early thousands. But overall, since I would say 2006, 2007, there has been a nice increase, right? Trend in how many applicants that we have to US medical schools. Again, this is specifically just US medical schools. Also, these are just allopathic schools. So there's two types of medical schools. There's allopathic and osteopathic, and I'll talk a little bit about the difference later. And so what we're seeing here is that the overall amount of applicants just this past cycle were a little bit over 50,000. Okay, this previous cycle, so this was during COVID, it was over 60,000. Okay, so a lot of people were applying. And so the projections here are just increasing the amount of, in terms of how many applicants are applying. So more and more people basically want to be doctors. Okay, and at the same time, we're seeing this shift in gender. Okay, so in this green line right here, these are the male applicants. And then this dotted gray line right here are the female applicants, right? And so the difference here is that we're seeing that more women are applying to medical school, which is interesting because it's always been a little bit more men who are applying, right? And then now there's a shift. So we're seeing a lot more women applying. And there's this little gap going on right here. It's not necessarily a huge gap, right? It's just it's a small difference, but still that we're seeing more women applying to medical school. And actually, at Penn State, my class has more women than men. So yeah, so that's a new trend that we're seeing that I think a lot of people are excited because again, it shows this equity in terms of medicine and how our physicians are starting to look, right? So diversity becomes important in terms of gender, but also in terms of race. All right, so this was from 2021. So this is looking at basically these statistics right here. So at this nice little peak in 2021. So not the most recent. They haven't published those yet. So these are, again, the statistics from AAMC. And here, what we're seeing from 2020, right, there was an increase, almost an 18% increase in applicants. We do see that corrected for this cycle, right? So there's this big gap, this big jump that happened, and now it's still an increase from the previous cycle from 2019. But again, there's still this increase that we're seeing, right? So there was an 18% jump for 2021. And if you notice, the number of applicants, again, went up, right, from 50, so it was about steady at 50,000, and then it jumped up to 60,000, and then it, again, corrected itself, but it's still above 50,000. But notice the acceptances. So from 2017 to 2021, right, the acceptances are very stable, okay? And so the reason for that is that they haven't changed, right? The medical schools haven't changed. It's the same amount of medical schools. I think there might have been 1 or 2 medical schools that opened up recently, but the amount of medical schools that are opening up is not enough to accommodate how many people are actually interested in attending medical school. Okay, so the idea here is that it's very competitive, right? It's a very competitive process. So the demand is there, but the supply has been consistent, right? There's just they're not, even though we have a physician shortage, there aren't that many new medical schools that are opening up to make that difference, okay? Now, some of the important statistics that I want to talk about in terms of admission. So the first is the GPA. So the average GPA is 3.74, okay? Now there's 2 types of GPAs when we think about it in medical school. There's the science GPA, and then there's the cumulative GPA. So in college, what happens is you take a bunch of classes, right? You have to take general requirements, and then you have your major. And for the cumulative GPA, typically it's going to be a little bit higher, right? Depending on your major. Say you major in English, for instance, and you take all the pre-med science classes, and say you do very well in your English courses, right? Maybe that's your strength. But then your science courses, because they're harder, right, you don't do as well. So maybe you have a 3.8 in your English cumulative GPA, but then you have like a 3.6 in your science GPA, or maybe even lower, right? So what that does is it allows colleges or medical admissions officers to kind of look at the difference in your cumulative GPA versus your science GPA and understand, okay, how you're doing as an applicant in the major that you chose, right? But then also how you're doing specifically in the science courses that you would need to in order for you to be successful in medical school. Okay, so a question I might get is, what are the science classes, right? So your science GPA is going to, it's going to include BCPM, so biology, chemistry, physics, right, and math. So any classes that are under that realm, okay, so that includes statistics, that includes any math class, right, calculus, all of those are going to go under that, any physics course, any chemistry course, and then for biology, there's a bunch, right, there's neuroscience, environmental science, so all of that will go into the science GPA, and both of those are evaluated, okay. So the next important statistic is the MCAT. So I already told you the MCAT is the admissions exam. So it's the medical college admissions test is what it stands for. And this is the major test that every medical student has to take unless they're already in a program that is like a BA MD program that already gives them, waives the MCAT score. But generally, if you're in undergrad and you're getting a bachelor's degree or a master's degree, say you graduated and you did all your pre-med requirements and you're interested in medical school, you have to take the MCAT. So the average here is about a 512, which is a good score. That's equivalent to about a 27 on the ACT, okay, and about like a 1350 on the SAT. So it's about the 87th percentile. And this number just keeps increasing every year. So we're just seeing that the students who are getting accepted are just doing better generally, because these are the only two quantitative measures in your entire application to medical school. All right, so some more statistics to point out here that we're seeing, again, this increase in applicants by women, right? And then we're also seeing this increase in diversity of students. So the more diversity is better, because we know from research in patient health outcomes that patients who are of minority, right, who are minorities, they end up actually their outcomes, their health outcomes are much better if they have a physician who is also a minority. And so because the US population is so diverse, right? There is this need to make sure that we are incorporating a lot of diversity, right, within the medical schools, so that we are hitting on every single patient population as well. So we want to see more African Americans. We want to see more Hispanics, Latinos, all the different ethnicities as well. So all of that is being considered while you're applying for medical school. All right, and then the next slide. All right, so I just gave you a bunch of statistics. So the question here is what does this mean for pre-med students? So maybe you're a high school student and you're thinking about which college you want to enter, right? Maybe you are already in college and maybe you're a freshman or sophomore and you're thinking, okay, I've taken biology, maybe I want to continue this road or not, but I'm not sure. Or maybe you're somebody who's already graduated and you're thinking about doing pre-med and maybe switching careers, right? Or maybe doing a post-bac or something like that, right? So these are the different types of people generally who are applying for medical school. And so knowing all of these statistics and knowing the state of affairs, as I would like to say, the question really becomes, what are some of the challenges and the components that we need to think about when we're thinking about medical school? Okay, so the first thing is that every year there's more applicants, right? but it's generally the same number of seats that are available. So generally you have about 155 allopathic medical schools, and you have about 38 osteopathic medical schools. So what's the difference? The difference is basically in the United States, way back in the 1800s, when medicine first became a career, there were two different schools of thought. So the first one was called allopathic, and the idea here was all about using drugs and treatment, right, to cure diseases. Okay, that's allopathic. For osteopathic, the idea was using muscle manipulation. Okay, so with muscle manipulation, the idea is that if there's any sort of ailment, if you maneuver a muscle in a certain way, then that could aid in recovery, right? And so basically those two schools of thought haven't really changed, and they just evolved into two different ways of basically becoming a doctor. So that's the history behind osteopathic versus allopathic. The degrees that are given, so allopathic is an MD, that's a medical degree. So if you have to see somebody with MD, that means they went to an allopathic school. So that's the 155 schools, majority of the schools in the US. Now, if you've ever been to a physician and they had the two letters DO after their name, that stands for Doctor of Osteopathic Medicine. So that means that they attended a osteopathic school. Okay, so those are those 38. So allopathic, osteopathic. And the difference for a pre-med is basically how competitive you are these days. So that's usually how it translates. So for an allopathic school, which are the statistics that I showed you, they're much more competitive, right? So that's where you have to have that 3.8 GPA, top MCAT scores. For DO, generally it's a little bit more lax. So your GPAs can be around 3.4, okay? Your MCAT scores can be like around a 507, 505 is enough, right? So it's just basically another way of pursuing a career in medicine if you just didn't do so well, you know, in undergrad, and you don't want to spend years trying to increase your GPA or increase your MCAT score. So I can talk about this all day. I don't want to spend too much time on the difference here, but I know I'm going to get some questions about it. So I just wanted to kind of briefly go over it. But generally for a DO versus an MD, they have to take different licensing exams, but DOs can actually take allopathic MD licensing exams so that they can do residencies. It just becomes a little bit more competitive for them. So if you're a top DO student, then you might be able to do a residency for an MD program, okay? So we can talk more about that if anybody has questions. All right, so going back to this. So yeah, so we have more applicants, but the same number of seats, right? And this really means that to get into a DO program or an MD program, right, you really have to start planning early, okay? So if you're a high school student watching this, awesome, great. You know, you're doing everything you're supposed to do, right? You're already getting a huge head start. You're understanding the needs and how competitive it is and what you need to do, right, to start to think about. What's really important is going to be your course selection, right? Which college you go to. So some colleges are going to be great if you want to do business or finance or engineering, but they're not going to be great if you want to do medicine, okay? And again, I can answer those questions at the end about why, but generally certain schools are going to just be set you up for success than other types of schools for especially for pre-meds. So GPA and MCAT, same thing. So preparing to take courses that you could generally expect to be successful in, right? Especially thinking about your cumulative versus your science GPA. Another one is your MCAT score, right? So preparing for the MCAT early. So there's 5 sections on the MCAT. They're going to cover everything in terms of your pre-med courses. So that means you get tested on physics, chemistry, biochemistry, organic chemistry, verbal reasoning, just like you did for the ACT or SAT. There's even a psychology and sociology section. So all of that is being tested. And so you have to start preparing for the MCAT early as well. All right. And then also we have just like for college admissions, we have the personal and academic narrative, right? So with the personal and academic narrative, the question becomes, what's your personal reasons? Why are you interested in medicine in the first place, right? Why are you taking the classes that you're taking? If you're a science person, why are you interested in science? If you're somebody who is majoring in English, and I'm just using English as one example here, then why do you want to be a doctor, right? So the question here is really starting to develop a good narrative and a good reason for why you want to pursue such a long and arduous career, right? All right, and that goes along with the extracurriculars, the essays, as well as the interviews. So the extracurriculars are going to basically prove your narrative, right? The essays are going to show that you first of all can articulate, right, why you want to go into medicine, but also they show how well you can communicate, right? And communication is very important as a physician. So now the big emphasis in medical school is all about humanities, actually. So even for me when I was my first year of medical school, we had to do a bunch of humanity classes on just learning how to be empathetic and how to talk to patients and how to write. A lot of it was reflections. So all of that becomes important as a doctor. And so they want to see that when you're applying. So for the interviews as well, we have traditional interviews and MMI interviews. And so both of them are going to really show your personality as well. And so there is a finesse to how we interview. There's also making sure that you have a strong and appropriate medical school application list, just like we did for college admissions. And then we also have the application timeline. And what's interesting about medical school is that it's not the same as college admissions. So actually it's all rolling admissions. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that. But the whole idea here that I really wanted to say was just that it's really important that we avoid costly mistakes. And when I say costly, I mean it by time, okay? Because time becomes its own resource, okay? It has a lot of value if you are interested in medicine, okay? And the reason is because you have to do 4 years bachelor's, right? And then 4 years of medical. So that's 8 years. And then residency is typically 3 to 4 years, depending on what you're doing. And then if you want to specialize, it'll be another 1 to 2 years, depending on which specialty. So you're really investing a lot of time. You're investing all of your 20s, and really depending on what you want to go into and how much more you want to invest. So again, it's important to avoid these costly mistakes so that you can, pursue your passion, pursue your calling, but not at the cost of, maybe your other goals in life, right? Which maybe are more personal to you. Let's see. Go to the next slide here. Okay, so this slide is for those of you who might have questions about the timeline. So I threw the slide on here because I just wanted, especially if you're somebody who's close to applying for the cycle, you might already know this, but maybe if you're a sophomore or a freshman, or maybe even you're in high school and you want to know a little bit about the process, it's a little bit different than college, okay? So for medical school admissions, what we're doing here is we are thinking about the date that we want to start medical school, okay? That's usually how it starts. So say you want to finish your undergraduate degree in 4 years, okay? And right after you want to start medical school, meaning you graduate in May, right? You celebrate your graduation, and then in July, you want to start medical school, okay? If that's your timeline, then that's the perspective I'm going to talk about, then great, right? But you have to be very, very organized. Most students actually do not start medical school right after they graduate. Actually, in fact, majority of the students take at least 1 year or 2 years to prepare their applications, okay? Because the whole process takes 2 years. I'm talking so much, I just need some water. So, all right, so what we're seeing here is that, so again, going back to the perspective that we're starting medical school right after we finish undergrad, what we do here is that we're thinking about our sophomore year. Okay, so this is the summer of our sophomore year. So sophomore year would be year 2 of college. So what we're doing here is we're really taking the time, usually in the summer, to prepare for the MCAT. Okay, so by the end of your sophomore year, you really wanted to have taken most of your pre-med requirements, okay? And just take the MCAT at least once, right? You finish, right? You finish your MCAT, hopefully, and you go through, hopefully you're happy with your score, and if not, then it's okay, right? Because in the fall, right? So at the end of your sophomore year, you would have hopefully are studying for the MCAT. Maybe I usually recommend my students to take it by the August because they have those 2 months to really study. And then they start their junior year, right, around September. So that's the fall semester. And during their junior year, this is when you're taking some harder classes typically. You can, if you're not ready to take the MCAT in the summer, then you have until the end of April. Okay, so the last date is usually right in mid to end April. Okay, so you take your MCAT and you get your score, and so you know where you're at. Okay, so this is your junior year. This is your 3rd year in undergrad. And then you have to submit something called your primary application. So this is a lot like your Common App. Okay, so if anybody has already applied for college, you know what the Common App is. It's the general application. So typically for college, you have one essay and you're filling a lot of information. Maybe you are putting in your resume, maybe you're throwing in some extracurriculars. For medical school, it's the same thing, except you have a personal statement as well. But you have this section where you have to put all your activities, okay? And all of your activities, 3 of them you have to pick are your most meaningful. And those 3, you have to write essays for them, okay? So it's really important, right, that your essays kind of reflect that personal narrative that we talked about before. And then after you submit your primary application, you will have about a month or so to really think about submitting your secondary application. So typically you will get those essay prompts earlier through the internet. You can find them usually, but sometimes some schools will switch the essay prompts, but you would need to start to at least prepare some of those essays. So these are a bunch of essays, maybe 3 to 4 essays per medical school that are very specific to the medical school. And if they're interested, they'll have you submit that secondary application. So most applicants will get a secondary application. Unless your GPA is very low and you're not hitting that cutoff point, then they won't give you a secondary. All right, and then lastly, we can do scheduling and completing the interviews. So typically what's happening here is after you submit your secondary application, it's very important that you submit it in mid-July. What happens is you will start waiting. And this is your senior year, basically. So senior year, hopefully you're not taking too many hard classes, and hopefully you can get a few interviews. And yeah, you can complete your interviews and you will start getting admission offers. If the first interview is scheduled for August, right, or September, you might know right away, or you might know earliest, probably I would say is October, all the way to January, February. You might be able to get an admission offer later during the cycle because people get put on wait lists. So like, for instance, for me, I got into, I was at Penn State, and it was the perfect school for me because I wanted to be close to my fiance at the time and also my family who were in New Jersey. And so, so when I got in, I immediately was like, this is a school I want to go to. And there was another school, a really great school in Colorado that I interviewed at and I wanted to go to as well because they had a great pulmonary medicine and biology program. And they had waitlisted me. And I didn't get in until I was already taking classes in July. I had already started and I was preparing for my first exam. And then I got the email saying, oh, congratulations, you got accepted to Colorado. And I was like, well, that's way too late. So that'll happen, right? So that's exactly the kind of stuff that happens in medical school, where people will start medical school and then decide, you know what, I want to wait a year, so they'll take like a leave for a year. And you can do that, which is great if you really want to, but generally it's not something that you see typically people do. But at least you get your acceptance, and then you can spend the year relaxing, doing whatever you want, and then starting medical school the next year. So you can defer for a year. That's the term that it's called, which I know people have done. And then you can move up and down the wait list by doing so. All right, so the key takeaways here that we have a lot of essays. Usually, typically your MCAT is taken right before you apply, so depending on your MCAT score. Another key takeaway here would be that this whole process, again, takes about 2 years. So you can see and imagine why people like to take their gap years, right? And we call it gap year, but it's not really a gap year, right? Because most people are doing research, or they're doing volunteering, right? They're still doing things that are still showing that they're interested in medicine and that they're active, right? That they're not just sitting on a beach, right? Not doing anything, which there's nothing wrong with doing that for a month, maybe, if you want. I would say like 2 or 3 weeks of doing that, and then working, doing something that shows that you're still productive and that you're still interested in medicine. But I can talk more about gap years in the questions at the end. All right, so this slide so I made this slide and I did it so that we can really think about priorities, right? So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so these are the big priorities for medical school applications. Okay, so the first 2 that are, I would say from my personal experience, are the most important are the GPA and MCAT score, okay? Why? Because they're the only 2 quantitative measures, right? And a quantitative measure is a very reliable measure. Number one, because it's easy to standardize, especially the MCAT score, right? And it's easy to compare amongst other applicants, okay? So the science GPA becomes very important, as well as the cumulative GPA, like we talked about, as well as your MCAT score. So if your GPA and your MCAT score are good, or hitting the average for the schools that you're thinking about, and each school has their own, they publish their own admissions criteria and their averages each year. So if you're hitting those scores and you're in a good spot, then that's the okay to just apply. Okay, that's what I believe. Now 3, 4, and 5 are all basically cherries on top, and they're going to really differentiate you from getting into maybe like a top 10 school from like a top 20, top 30, or even any school, right? So, and it all depends on the student, right? So your leadership, your clinical experience, your volunteering, your research, all of those are going to be things that admissions officers, which are basically a big admissions committee of a bunch of doctors, are going to be looking at. And so the things that I think are going to really show that you want to be a physician are the obvious things, right? Anything that shows that you care about people, right? Empathy. So volunteering, it doesn't really matter what type of volunteering that you do. Any sort of volunteering that just shows that you're an empathetic person will help. You have to have clinical experience. What does that mean? You can volunteer at a hospital, you can shadow a doctor, right? You can be a medical scribe. So there's a lot of ways to get clinical experience. Leadership is a great way to show that you can step up to the plate when you need to. And so, showing that you were part of a club, or that you started something, or that you pursued a certain passion, right? Where you maybe led a team. That's really important in medicine, because in medicine, you're going to be part of a team, right? And you're also going to be leading a team at some point, right? Especially in medical school and later on in your career. So the last component for activities is research. And so research can really fall under scientific bench lab research, all the way to social research, right? So where you're surveying people and doing qualitative research. It doesn't all have to be, scientific research when I put research. And that's what makes the class interesting. So that's the kind of stuff they're looking for, is like diversifying the medical school class. So don't just think you have to work in the lab. Now, if you're interested in MD, PhD, like I am, like I'm currently doing, then working in a lab, right, doing bench lab work is going to make more sense. But if you're somebody who's interested in a medical degree, then you don't need to do scientific research, right? You can, I know a friend of mine who was surveying people in Native American reservation camps, right? And just getting a broad understanding, a broad study of alcoholism, right? So something as simple, right? Sounds simple, but it's not. It's a very social science approach to asking a question. That type of research is all right as well. So again, they're looking for the narrative. Why did you do this research? Okay, because I get a lot of questions about that as well. The fourth is recommendation letters. So typically you want to get at least 2 science recommendation letters. So, you know, usually it's 2 science courses that you took that you did pretty well, and hopefully you got A's in them, that your professor can really attest to your knowledge and your understanding of tough concepts. You would also need a recommendation letter from a non-science professor. So again, if you were an English major, I would recommend getting an English professor, right, to write you that non-science professor. So typically you can submit between 3 to 6 recommendation letters. I would generally stick to 3 to 4. It's not really about quantity here, it's really about quality. Can you get strong recommendation letters? Did you build mentorships with these professors, right, with these people? Can they vouch for you, not only in your abilities, but also your personality? Because a lot of medicine has to do with personality, right, and being a people person. Because again, you're working with people, right? And then lastly, it's awards. So I sit on the recruiting committee for my MD PhD program, and I do a lot for the medical admissions as well. My husband actually, he does medical school admissions as well for Penn State, and he did it for University of Pennsylvania. And so, you know, we're both interested in academia, and we're both interested in admissions and administration. And something that, you know, we always talk about is the awards, right? That's something that's, you don't really see a lot of, you know, students who might get Fulbright scholarships, right? Or Truman scholarships or Rhodes scholarships, right? So when you do see people who do win these really impressive competitive awards, it impresses everybody, right? Because the difference between medical school admissions and college admissions is that for college admissions, you typically have these admission officers, right? So these are people who have like a master's in education, right? Who are looking, you know, to fill the class, right? And with a lot of different diversity. But for medical school admissions, you don't have officers. You just have basically staff members who are typically physicians, right? Who are professors typically, who are clinical physicians, or even they're PIs, principal investigators, who are on the admissions committee. And they're professors who work with students every day. And so they are the ones who know a lot about the awards. They know a lot about different activities, right? And they're looking for very specific things to impress them. So if you're looking to get into Harvard Medical School, for instance, you might want to get a publication. You might, you know, you're expected to get, you know, be on the dean's list. You're really like the top of the top, right, of the you know, most competitive application pool, right? And so, yeah, so if you want to compete and get into a school like Harvard, then yeah, you should be expected to get some really impressive awards. But, you know, if you're looking at all the other types of schools that are not the top 2 or 3, like Stanford, Harvard, these big name medical schools, then, you know, getting the dean's list or getting a publication would be enough, right, to really impress people. So there's a wide range here to really get yourself noticed and admitted. All right, okay. So this slide here is really talking about options beyond the MD. So this will be my last slide before I go into some of the consulting services and take some questions. So in this case, I talked already about the DO. So if, you know, ideally you want to get a medical degree, an MD, you want to go to an allopathic school because you have a bunch of residencies that are open to you, okay? So that means if you're interested in plastic surgery, neurosurgery, cardio, thoracic surgery, all the different types of surgeries, all the way down to, and by down, I mean, you know, non-surgical specialties. So pediatrics, family medicine, which are not as competitive, for instance, then, you know, the MD will give you that that option to apply for those residencies. The DO is not going to give you that 100%. So DO is really great if you are interested in primary care provider, right? So being a PCP. So again, pediatrics, family medicine, internal medicine, DOs are great for that because most of the residencies for DOs are that. Now, some DO schools have opened up, some hospitals, mostly like small private hospitals, have opened up residencies in orthopedic surgery. They're not necessarily like accredited or anything, so you're not being protected as a resident necessarily, but if you really want to be an orthopedic surgeon and you went to a DO school, you can. Another option is to, again, take board exams that are that would allow you to apply for residencies for MD students. So you're competing with MD students, which again is a little bit, but if you're stellar DO student, then you can compete and effectively, and you can definitely get admitted. And I actually personally know people who are DOs who got into anesthesia residencies and other really tough specialties, but it's not the norm. And you'd really have to be a top student within your DO school to do that. Another option, I'm sure you guys have all heard of, are the Caribbean schools. So this is basically an international program. So if you're somebody who didn't do so great in undergrad and you made some mistakes, your GPA is below a 3.4, I would typically say, and you don't want to take a gap year and you don't want to try and fix your GPA and you just, time is of essence for you, then you go to the Caribbean, and there's a couple of Caribbean schools that are generally considered have better reputations. Like Ross, for instance, is a big one that you might have heard of. And so these schools, I can talk a lot about. I'm not going to spend too much time, but they are an option. They're not great options, but you can, again, get into a Caribbean school, finish your medical school there, and then find a residency in the US. It's not great because some of these are really just like money sinks, and they make it really difficult to pass medical school, and they really may not prepare you the best. So they don't have great reputations in general, but they are an option. And I know people who've gone through the process and who are in residency right now. So you, again, if the goal and your dream is to become a doctor, you can do it, but you just, again, these are circuitous ways to doing it, not the ideal option, but they are options. There are also international programs that are available, so you don't necessarily have to go to the Caribbean. Caribbean is more just for U.S. citizens who went to American schools. So you're going to be around people that are similar to you. In the international programs, maybe you want to go to Germany. I know students who've done that, went to German medical schools because it's free there. But then you're being treated like an international doctor. So then you have to go through the USMLE board exam, licensing exams, which can be a little bit difficult for an international student. But again, it's not impossible, right? So it's just a little bit, it just makes your life harder. So there are other options beyond the MD if you are still interested in medicine, but again, maybe you don't want to commit to the full training. Maybe again, your GPA is not looking so great. Maybe you took the MCAT 2 or 3 times and you're just not getting good scores. Then, PA is a great option. That's a physician associate degree. So basically it's a 2-year degree program, but you get to work in the hospital. You're kind of considered a mid-level is the term that we give in the hospitals, but you are under a physician typically, but you do have some autonomy. In some states you can write prescriptions. Same thing with NP, that's a nurse practitioner. So usually this is through the nursing route. Again, there's a lot of autonomy as a nurse practitioner because you can write prescriptions, but you still have to be under a doctor, a DO or an MD. Cardiac perfusionist is a great field. Again, this is a 2-year master's program where you're working in the cardiac surgeries, basically. And then lastly is an MPH. So this is a master's in public health. So these are people who are typically working for the government or a nonprofit who are studying epidemiology. So a lot of the COVID statistics that we found all came from MPHs. So what are the pros and cons? Like I talked about, is the USMLE step 1 and step 2. So step 1 just turned into pass-fail. So typically for international students, for DOs students and Caribbean students, the step 1 exam was like a great way to differentiate yourself, right? If you can score better than an MD student on the step 1 exam, then, right, there's no reason why you can't take their spot, right? For residence, you can't compete. But now they turned it pass fail. So because they turned it pass fail, it's really all about step 2 CK, which is the clinical skills exam. So it just makes it a little bit harder for DO students, Caribbean and international students to compete, right? Because before they had 2 exams to really showcase their talent. Now they only have 1 exam to do so. But again, it's not impossible. And same thing with the residency match, is that residencies become more challenging, right, to get accepted, but again, not impossible. All right, so at Potomac Oak, so really my approach personally is a mentorship approach. Because I've been through the process, for me, my experience at Penn was really grueling. I really had to push myself hard to do well at a very competitive school like Penn, that's notorious for grade deflation, which means that the average in our classes, if you got an average on the exam, it would be like a B or B minus sometimes. So it was a very, very competitive environment. And so, preparing early, doing well, and living under that stressful environment and still trying to, pursue your dream of being a doctor is really stressful, especially if you're coming from a high school where you were doing great, right? For me, I was, not to brag, I was a valedictorian, so I was also used to doing well in school. But when I came to Penn, I kind of found myself a little bit more average. And so I kind of had to learn quickly and adapt and gain some mentors and really do the legwork to get myself at a point where I knew what I needed to know to get into medical school and pursue my passion, my dreams. And so same thing, so I kind of like to give back. I view every student I work with as a mentee. I try to give them the best advice that I've gotten over the years and what I've learned. And so the idea here is that if you're interested in medical school, maybe it's not your passion yet, right? Maybe, you're considering it. I would suggest like a planning package here where, maybe you're a freshman, maybe you're still in high school. And the idea here is to just kind of get to know you a little bit, right, through our initial meeting. And then we do about 2 check-ins, right? So understand where you're at in terms of your grades, your course selection, what you're doing for extracurricular activities to build up your resume, making sure that you're getting that clinical experience, and just starting to build the narrative for you. Because again, you kind of have only 3 years to plan, right? So freshman, sophomore, and junior year, that's it. If you want to go right straight through, you will have more time if you take gap years, right? And then from there, what I'll do is I'll check on you over the summer, and again, just kind of build that rapport and then give you an annual report, right? So making sure where the student is progressing in terms of their long-term and short-term goals, and then giving them assignments, right? And understanding where that application and how it's going to look in the future, right? So that's the planning. So for all of these packages that we're offering for admissions, so if you're somebody who's applying this cycle, or maybe you're thinking about applying for next cycle, all the packages include the planning. Or if you're somebody who's just is interested in the planning alone, we can talk about that as well. So the packages that we're offering are basically a comprehensive packages that are going to include everything that you would need to apply for medical school, where you're getting the guidance that you need. So the services are really up to about 18 schools. We're really going to make sure that we're looking at your medical school selections. We're developing this action plan, right? We're building that resume. And then I think that are really important, really building that personal statement, your meaningful activities. And then depending on which package you purchase, we can also edit these secondary essays, which are about 3 to 4 per school, right? That I talked a little bit about. And then also interview prep, right? So how to properly interview for traditional versus there's a specific type of interview that we call the multiple mini interview, and this is called an MMI interview. That's very specific towards medicine, where they basically ask you these like tough questions and you have to come up with a solution. And the idea there is to test your thinking, your critical thinking. And then also guiding you through the whole process, right? Making sure that you're writing back to your interviewers, right, your update letters, so all the different components that are part of the process that's been taken care of. And then also talking a little bit about recommendations. So these are the packages. So if you're interested, please book a consultation. They're free. You can go to www.potomacadmissions.com and just fill out the form, and then we can book a 30-minute consultation, and hopefully we can get an idea of what your needs are and what questions you might have, so that we can better tailor a package for you. Okay. So with that, I'm going to open it up for questions.
I just want to make a quick announcement. If you want to ask questions, please make sure that you are asking to everyone or to Farah directly. If they're coming to me, Farah will not get to see them.
Okay, great. All right, so I'm just scrolling through all these questions. All right, so the first question we got here is, does med school involve math? And when you are in a medical career, how much math do you use? So yes, there is some math, but it's not calculus, and it's not pre-calc, and it's not geometry. It's none of that. It's really mostly statistics. But again, if you're interested in, for instance, anesthesia or cardiology, there is definitely a lot of math there, but not necessarily where you have to do problems, right? But you are definitely needing to understand equations, right? And relationships. So those are things that you will see throughout all the sciences, like any sort of algebra, right? Algebra 2, typically, understanding how to interpret graphs, right? Those are all really part of it, but it's nothing like, you don't have to do theorems or proofs or anything like that. I hope that answers your question. And feel free to chime in during the seminar if that didn't answer your question. I'll be happy to further elaborate. Next question I got is, will this recording be shared afterwards? Yes. Right, Eliza? Believe so.
Yes, it'll be shared. Just send us an email and we're happy to send the recording to anyone.
All right, so high school student here, how important to take the CS courses? So that's computer science courses, I'm guessing, how AI will impact the medical industry. Yeah, so CS courses, so something I didn't really talk about, but I think would be a great point here to talk about is every single medical student, including myself, right? We all had a plan A, right? And a plan B, okay? So for me, my plan A was, become a doctor, but my plan B was possibly do, research, just pursue PhD, maybe do consulting, like biotechnology consulting or healthcare consulting. So that was kind of like my plan B. Other people I know were majors in economics, for instance, but then did all the pre-med requirements. And so their plan A was medicine, but their plan B became, work in finance, okay? So you can take, you could be a computer science major, okay? Definitely 100%. And maybe your plan A would be to have a medical career, right? And your plan B could be to be a software engineer, right? There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Now, if your plan A is to be a computer scientist and your plan B is to be a medical doctor, that's a recipe for disaster, right? Because GPA is so important in medicine, and computer science, we know, very competitive, right? And especially if you go to a top program. And so you don't want to take classes that are going to jeopardize your GPA. But if you want to be a good computer scientist, then you have to take those tough classes, right? And that goes for engineers as well. So there is this balance, right? In terms of, what classes you take, what programs you go into if you're thinking about pre-med. But the question is how important is it for medicine? It's really not. I mean, the only thing that I can say for my PhD, I had to take a statistics class and I had to learn how to code, but it was very basic coding like R, so nothing fancy. Now I have 2 students in my class, for instance, who are both who majored in math, and they both know how to code, they know how to use Python and all the different programming, but they use that for their PhD. So this is like, if you're interested in an MD PhD, then bioinformatics is a great way to apply computer science. But if not, then it's not really relevant if you're in clinical medicine. You know, usually we will hire a bioinformatician to do all of that work for us. So as physicians, we're not really generally expected to know how to code and to know all of that. So is it important? Sure, if you're going to do research in it, but it's not like a necessity or anything. It's just like a cherry on top situation. And yeah, AI has already impacted the medical industry, right? We've seen that it's impacting in terms of telemedicine, for instance. We're seeing it impact it in terms of diagnosis. A lot of the softwares that we use to manage hospitals, as well as different antibiotics that we're using, we use AI. So yeah, AI is huge in medicine, especially in genetics. So any sort of big data. Oh man, I don't know if I'm going to be able to answer all these questions. Okay, we have a lot of questions. So let's try to do this. Eliza, do we have a time limit?
Yeah, so we'll keep it to 6:30 and try to answer as many questions as possible. But for questions about your specific student situations, I think that's more appropriate for consulting rather than like an overall kind of answer for everyone. So for example, I think I'm looking through some of the questions. Yeah, so like for the general kind of, what are your recommendations? What's a good GPA? I think those are probably better for kind of consulting situations because it's so relative for the individual student situation.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So yeah, so what extracurriculars would you recommend for pre-med applicants who's not able to do any sports? Yeah, so that would be something I would have to talk to you personally about, depending on your interests. The next question, what majors would you recommend? Does it always have to be some? That's a good question. So that's a question I get a lot. So the question is, what majors would you recommend? Does it always have to be something like biology or a science major? And does your major affect your chances of getting in? So the answer here is no. It's a definitive no. Actually, in fact, doctors, we really, really want a hybrid of careers, right? We don't want just science people, right? Those are the MD PhDs are gonna, like if you're interested in getting an MD PhD, yes, please major in biology, do the science research, do all that traditional stuff, right? But it's not a requirement. Please, like, do whatever you're interested in. Like if you're interested in computer science, do computer science, right? But just make sure you're hitting that clinical experience, right? Make sure you're hitting the volunteering. Do everything you need to do, but make sure you're tying it back in. And what's nice about medicine is that you can literally tie any field with medicine. I can't imagine a single field that you cannot tie medicine. You have engineering, right? Biomedical engineering, you can tie that in. You can tie business, right? A lot of what we do at the hospital, insurance companies, that all has to do with business and finance. So sociology, right? So all these different majors will English, right? Everything can really be tied into the humanities aspect of medicine, because medicine is not just about science. Yes, you need to be smart, you need to work hard, and you need to do well in your science courses and understand difficult concepts under a very short, time constraint. You need to be able to do that and do well on tests, but that's not all you do as a doctor. So good question. Another good question, what courses do you recommend to take in high school apart from biology, chemistry? I think you should definitely take statistics if you can take physics. We're seeing those are generally really tough classes for students in college who haven't seen them before. And most students don't take statistics in high school, but I think that would help them a lot if they do, or even if they take it as a summer class, at the local community college. But physics is another big one, but definitely biology and chemistry. What extracurriculars or voluntary services or internships can high schoolers do? It's tough for high school. I would say get some exposure, maybe like I did. I definitely got exposure in high school just to help me see if I liked being in the hospital. So if you can do any sort of, volunteer work or physician shadowing, that would be helpful. IB versus AP doesn't really matter, has no difference. There's zero consequence at all to your medical career. What extracurricular voluntary services or okay, so I already got that one. So yeah, there's a lot of programs in high school. So there's NIH offers like research programs. But none of it is really, it's just the idea is to get your student or your son or daughter really just exposed, okay, to medicine. That's the whole point, I would say, in high school is they're considering being a doctor. I think would be really great if you know somebody in the family, or maybe a family friend, or maybe just somebody in the community who would be willing to let them go in and just shadow, right? Usually doctors, again, most people who become physicians are very empathetic people in general, and they want to give back and they want to help. So I always tell my students to reach out to somebody. It could be cold calling, especially now with COVID not being as big of an issue. Some private practice clinics are definitely more they're more open to having students. Is there any information about BS-MD programs? So there's a bunch of BS-MD programs. So actually, Eliza would probably know more about that than I do, because she works with those students directly. But there's a couple of the BS-MD programs there that are around. So yeah, if you just Google it, you'll find a bunch of them. I know there's one at Rutgers, there's one at Arizona State. And New York, downstate, SUNY downstate has one as well. So just look it up and you'll find all the list. So how do medical schools look at double majors, especially computer science graduates? Yeah, so double majors are impressive, I think, but don't do a double major just to be impressive. I think it's tough to do a double major. So if you can do a double major, do it. Some advisors will say, don't, just do one major, focus on one, and then get a minor. That was the advice I actually got, because I was doing a double major. I was doing a psychology, biology, but everybody was my advisors were like, why do both? Just pick one and focus on one. But looking back, I don't think it really mattered. I think if I had done a double major, it wouldn't have made a huge difference either way, because I still would have been interested in medicine. It just would have meant more classes for me to take. But it didn't really impact, for my personal experience, didn't really impact me. But I think if I was to look at a piece of paper and look at two applicants, and one did a double major and got a GPA that's the same as somebody who got a single major, I might look at the one who did the double major a little bit more favorably. But that really depends on, but that's not the reason why they would be chosen, right? So it really just, again, everything else matters. It's a holistic approach. So interview, essays. How to reduce costs of medical school. So NYU offers a full ride. An MD PhD program offers. There's certain programs that you don't have to pay for medical school, which is great. So depending on which programs you decide to do, I know the U.S. Army also is they offer like a scholarship basically, so you can get a scholarship if you're looking for it. But again, that's one of the positives about MD PhDs, is that you're not really paying for medical school, but you are giving up 4 to 5 years of your life getting a PhD. When applying to medical school, how do we stand out? So yeah, I mean, it's not really about standing out too much. It's about showcasing yourself, right? And your strengths. So you're not directly competing. Everybody's going to have a good GPA. Everybody's going to have a good MCAT score. So it's really having a good story, right? It's your narrative. That's really going to be important here. So thinking about what you stand for and what you're passionate about. It's much easier when you're pursuing something that you really care about, right? That when you interview, or even when you write your essays, it really comes out, right? But if you're not doing that, if you're just doing it to do it, it's going to be very clear, and people will see right through that. Because again, you're having doctors read your essays, right? So they can tell right away if it's your parents who are making you apply, right? And you're not really passionate about it, they can tell that. So you really have to be authentic to yourself, right? And again, that's what makes it so difficult to get in, is that you really need to show your authenticity, and you need to show your passion as well. Let's see, do you have better chances if you apply to pre-med school for a given medical school? Not sure I understand what that means. That I went to Penn, would it have been easier because I went to Penn for me to get into UPenn's medical school? Not necessarily. I think, maybe if you know somebody, maybe, but I doubt that. Maybe. I don't really have an answer to that 100%. I don't think you should go to an undergrad just because you think you're going to get into their medical school. Sometimes medical schools will actually want to take students outside of their pre-med, their undergrad, because they want to diversify their pool, right? So, but if you're in the medical school, it's the different is that when you're in medical school, the residency programs will prefer their own, right? Especially if you're a top student, if you're a top medical school, they want to keep the good students, right? But for pre-meds, it's not necessary, but maybe. All right, so how the work and personal life balance compensation will be at the time of residency. Yes, so residency is really tough. There's no, depends on your residency, but most of the time residency is not a great work-life balance. My husband, when we were dating, he was going through residency, and and that was really tough because he had to work all the time, and his hours were very just non-ideal, but it's doable. It is doable. You just have to really make the effort. And that's the same thing with medicine, right? In general, as a pre-med, and every aspect of it, you just have to really do well with time management, organization. And that's something that, I really emphasize with my students. I really help them with that as well, is really building a good schedule and sticking to it, and then learning how to balance, the important things, the priorities in your lives, but also not jeopardizing, your grades by doing so. And so there is definitely a dance that you do, but once you get a routine and a habit, good habit building, then it becomes a lot easier. It doesn't get harder, it does get harder, but you get better at it, I think is the quote that I like to live by. I already answered this one. IB versus AP, again, it has no difference. Do you recommend taking AP credits and skipping some courses, or do you recommend retaking the AP courses? Some people told me that med schools want you to take all the courses. Yes, yes, yes. So the answer here is do not skip the classes. So if your son or daughter took an AP class, right? So they took AP biology, and you scored a 5, right? And school will tell you, okay, well, you can, get out of the 5, or you can take biology 101, take the introductory class. So for medicine, it's the complete opposite. So with college admissions, yes, you want to take the toughest classes, right? You want to prove to colleges that you can handle tough classes, right? But for medical school, it's all about your GPA. So you don't want to take the toughest classes, right? You want to take the classes that you can get A's in, right? That's the strategy here. You still want to take some tough classes. You have to, right? You have to take organic chemistry, which is notoriously difficult. You have to take biochemistry, right? Depending on your major, you might have to take much harder classes. But with biology, I'm of the school of thought where I think even if you got a 5 on the AP bio exam, I think taking a college level biology class and just repeating a lot of that information is just going to further solidify that information and make you think about it from a more from a different perspective, right? So you might learn something new that you didn't in your high school class, right? So is it impossible to get into medical schools with a GPA of a 3.45 or 5? No, it's not impossible. I think you can get in with a 3.4. So you can get in. So don't worry too much, right? So it just depends on your story.
So fair, I'm gonna jump right in. Anyone who wants a recording of today's meeting, I put the email for recording requests in the chat to Lisa at potomactutoring.com. I do want to be respectful of Farah's time. So I think Farah, you could take one more question, and then I'm very sorry if we were not able to get to your question. You can always reach out to us and schedule a consultation. The one question that I do want to personally answer is that I do see someone said, if we use professional help on essays, will medical schools not notice that the essays are not authentic? So all of our consultants, including Farah, pride ourselves on being very careful with our edits. Our job is not to write for you or change your story or change who you are. It's really to make sure that you put your best foot forward. So obviously no grammar mistakes, right? But also to make sure that the narrative of your story actually makes sense and it is compelling, right? So it's not so much as like we're rewriting your essay, but really making sure that you're writing the right stories for your essay, that you're telling the right things that are going to really help increase your chances for admission.
Yes, 100%, Eliza. Yes, exactly. It's all about being authentic to your voice. Yeah, so I mean, let me see. There's a couple good questions here. some of these are very, very specific. So I'm trying to find a good last one. Let's see. Let's see, I don't know. I like this one about like medical school. So is medical school similar to undergraduate classes? So medical school is interesting. So first of all, it depends on which school you go to. But most medical schools are actually pass fail because you just need to have a baseline of information. There's so much information in medicine. I mean, it is like the quote is always that if you felt like undergrad was hard, medical school is very, very difficult, but not because the material necessarily is difficult. It's the amount. It's kind of like a fire hydrant of material kind of coming at you. But it's interesting. If you love science and you love chemistry and you love all these different things and you're fascinated with the human body, it's so amazing that you get to apply all these different foundational concepts, right, to learn about how it applies to human diseases. So you're working with small groups, you get to, you get a little white coat and your stethoscope and you have your clinical skills training. So there's a lot where you're really being trained to be a physician. And so I would say, yes, a lot of the classes are recorded and the curriculum is really based off of which system. So sometimes you'll start with just foundations in terms of science, and then you can do cardiorespiratory, and then you can move on to kidney, and then you move on to GI. So it just depends on your curriculum and the medical school you're interested in. So I can talk more about that if you're somebody who's applying to medical school. I think as a high schooler, it might just sound a little too out of place for you. So I think for high schoolers, maybe just focus more on taking your pre-med courses, understanding the foundations and the basics, but do know that all of that will be important. I don't think every physics class I've taken, even organic chemistry, all of that actually did apply to understanding pharmacology, for instance, or different aspects of medicine that we need to know. So it's a multifaceted field, and so literally, like I said, you can major in so many different things and apply it to medicine. All right, so I'm so sorry I couldn't answer everybody else's questions. So please, yeah, just, book a consultation. It's for free. And, we can sit down, get to know, I can answer more questions and get to know the student a little bit more. And hopefully we can build a good relationship and meet your goals. So thank you all for attending the session. I hope this was helpful. I know it was a lot of information, but, I think the more information you get, the better, just to help you prepare. And yeah, and have a great rest of your weekend, everybody. And thanks for attending the seminar. Bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone. Thank you for coming.